I don't know if you guys would agree with this, but I'd like this to be less formal than us sort of like taking a position in more of a conversation. So feel free to jump in if we say something that you think you want to react to, or you have a response, or you're thinking along the same lines, because I think this could be a really generative sort of conversation, as well as like a synthesis of some of the themes and ideas that we've been talking about. So, I mean, one thing that struck me as I was sitting and listening to, I think I saw most of the presentations, was what wasn't talked about. And I mean, there's a lot that wasn't, but one of the main things that struck me was nobody really questioned or debated what is a digital story, or what is digital storytelling, right? And I think it was Lynn, is that? Yeah, it was like, I was surprised that I saw a lot of talks and nobody was showing digital stories, right? So, and that's not true, right? That's not necessarily true. So I guess one thing I thought we could talk about in these last, I don't know how many minutes left we have, is, that idea of like, well, what constitutes a digital story? And in a way, we don't need to decide on a definition. And I like that we didn't sort of say, well, that is and that isn't, because it does kind of offer a little bit of interpretive flexibility around this idea that's constantly evolving and should be evolving, and not to put certain limits, but also at the same time, I was a little bit also struck and slightly disappointed by the fact that a lot of the examples looked very familiar from a film and media studies perspective, that a lot of them felt very traditional to me. And it made me sort of question, well, then how are we conceptualizing the benefit of the digital, right? So like, what does digitality add to the story? We seem to have this sort of underlying consensus that stories are important. And I really liked the other keynote speaker's presentation, Kim Gallen, who really called attention to this idea of like, well, where are the stories in the visualizations that we show that are visually maybe compelling and more conceptual than experiential? So I think there was sort of this implicit agreement that stories are important, and stories humanize, and stories are part of the human experience and humanities inquiries. But I guess one thing I thought maybe we could think more about is, so what's the purpose, or what's the role of the digital as it sort of becomes entrenched and enmeshed and encoded in the storytelling process? That's one, I guess, sort of thought that I had while listening to everybody's things.
Yeah, I guess I can follow that up. Of course, for me, it's always interesting when I step into a space that's labeled as digital humanities, because I'm not really in digital humanities, according to some people who would say that digital humanities is about kind of the work that traditional humanities disciplines do with digital tools. What I do is I study the digital from a humanities perspective that's also infused with social science and lots of other good things. I don't really have a background in a traditional humanities discipline in the way that many of you do. I'm not grounded in a traditional department. I've never worked in one. And everything I kind of have gone through is interdisciplinary programs that are always about what's next in the technology and the code and the interfaces. And so in that world, which is game studies conferences and digital media conferences, we're constantly focusing on new tools, new platforms, and kind of vague competitions about who can do cooler procedural work than the next person. So here, to me, it's very interesting that the work, some of it does look like what I've been seeing in digital humanities conferences for about 10 years, right? Film is still film. There's interventions, there's changes in how things are presented, but I think I taught my first Omeka workshop 7 or 8 years ago, and we're still using it, and it hasn't changed that much. And the same could be said for a lot of things about humanities traditions don't necessarily change that rapidly. But I'm kind of curious from the perspective of those of you who are in humanities departments, whether you kind of see changing platforms and moving into some of these new affordances is desirable, or perhaps there's a reason why film is still dominant in the digital storytelling spaces and discourse.
I guess we're taking.
Well, and one thing too is as these new platforms open up with like VR and video game systems and flash dying and these other things that are opening up to try to replace these, having those access to those in these communities that are still trying to get the ability to make their imprint in their own communities, in their own work, in their own fields, still seem to be building barriers often on these systems. So regardless of it being a video game or a film, there's still this, for lack of a better word, these colonial structures that continue to pop up with everything, that we have to actually constantly come in and say, you know, we need more access, we need more opportunities. And although we can argue on all of these that there are some examples where that's happening, the systems still build themselves up constantly because of wealth, population, and the profit margin that happens continuously as these things develop. And the more developed they get, a lot of these walls go up quicker. And I know the stuff that I've worked with companies on, usually we had to get in early on the technology, because if you get in really early, you could jump in the door. And we could get into the iPhone because it just came out. And they hadn't built the infrastructure and the rules and policies completely yet before they decided, okay, well, if you don't have 15 million speakers, we're not putting you in. And later on with a SDK, you can develop your own keyboard, but not now. 3 years down the road, maybe you can. And so I noticed on all of this stuff with these things, as they build themselves, as VR and all of this stuff, if you jump in early, you can get into the digital side of things and do your own imprint and start having that conversation early on as one of the early people. But one of the things I'm always concerned on in these medias, from video game design and even film, it continues to, like, as it's more established on every platform, it starts to exclude people because the money starts coming in and people start supporting the stuff that actually makes money more heavily. And then smaller groups that are trying to make an impact seem to get left out often. So.
I mean, I'm curious. I'll jump in with a question, and the rest of you feel free to jump in whenever. I'm interested in this issue of access, especially since we have been talking about very different tools and technologies, everything from films to perhaps GIS. And I'm very interested in how we continue to reach the communities we work in, whether they are marginalized communities, whether they are students, and how these issues of access crop up in that. So do our students actually have access to the tools that we want to use in our classrooms, especially if they are these very new and exciting tools that everybody is talking about. And even if they have access to them, do they know what to do with them to create the kinds of transformative, radical projects that I think we might envision for digital storytelling? So I'm just wondering what challenges you have faced, and then of course all of you here, in thinking about issues of access and the tools that we adopt in our classrooms.
Well, coming from the games and media side, this is sort of interesting to me because a lot of what we value over in that space is open source projects. Anything that is developed with a kind of a collaborative mindset and released and available for free, not just in a complete form, but as something that can be modified, built upon, and challenged. And that's the mindset of open source. But the problems with open source are the barriers to entry and actually participating within an open source project are very high. The assumptions of code knowledge, and if someone who is not familiar with both the norms and discourse and procedures, as well as just the level of technical knowledge required to be a part of an open source project, they're likely not only to have their contributions rejected, but they're likely to be treated poorly. Kind of the same as what happens in the Wikipedia model, where people who try to jump into editing on Wikipedia and bring in perspectives that aren't normally heard or valued there often get faced with such an immediate shutdown and negative reactions that they don't go back. So, I know my concern when I think about the things we value over in making platforms is that there's a lot of people making open source platforms and saying, hey, we made this thing that it's supposed to be really valuable for people who have limited resources, perhaps older technology, and limited money to throw at software, but it's not necessarily actually reaching or made with the input of those communities because we're not operating the same spaces or the same discourse. So maybe it doesn't end up being all that useful. So I think we've got lots and lots of well-meaning open source projects, but I'm not seeing as many of them kind of used in practice. And I don't know how to gap gets bridged or how those conversations come more into unity, but I don't see it happening in digital humanities spaces because there's just not enough overlap between the people working in those tools and people in the humanities.
And that was really that idea of participatory design that I know we had a presenter. Joseph, you mentioned this as well, bringing in Cherokee language into the tools you designed.
I think there was a question, or yeah.
Well, I was just wondering, thinking to Joseph Bird's talk and his comments about the first reactions that communities might have, certain communities, to being invited to use certain technologies, and that's a problem with open source that maybe exists more on the margins. But I'm wondering if you, in your experience, have run into that problem outside the context of copyright and intellectual property. But if anything, I don't know, maybe the way a community feels what's appropriate to share, and what may be appropriate not to share, and how open source may be problematic in that regard.
Well, I don't know about open source, but one of the things I was thinking about in relationship to your question, actually in thinking about Joseph's talk earlier today, was that today? Today's a long day. Earlier today, the moments that you're mentioning in his talk too, is that often when we think about access to technologies or media literacy, like, yeah, that's all good, I guess, but they're often with these standardized benchmarks that aren't set by communities at all, right? So sort of being forced into certain types of digitality or forced into certain types of access that really might not be the best way to tell the story that the community wants to tell or that a person might want to tell, right? So, I mean, I was struck by what you said when people were like, oh, they're gonna steal our medicine like everything else, right? Like this idea of sharing is always put up as something really great, right? And sharing in an open source way and sharing digitally, right? But it's not just about the content that we might not want to share. There's definitely, I mean, even in the student populations that I work with, and I do some work around digital inclusion in Kansas City, is that, people don't necessarily need fast speeds to do what they want to do, right? But yet there's this sort of, a lot of forces at work that sort of define access in that way. So I think also, particularly with storytelling projects and intersecting storytelling with digitality, we should be thinking about the tools that are already in the hands of the people that we're working with, right? So we didn't see much about social media, or we didn't see much about mobile only, or sort of like text-based mobile communication networks or email. I mean, I loved that you kind of went there a little bit and saying, okay, well, maybe people are using iPhones now. This is the way that people are communicating. They're not going to the desktop. Let's see how we can hack the iPhone, or let's see how we can make the iPhone work for us, because that is where the access is, right? So I think there's some sort of shifting notion away from supply side to maybe, well, what do you have? What do you got? Like, let's sort of make that work and use what you're already using, and maybe digital isn't the way to share in some cases. Is that blasphemy to say in this space? I don't know.
Well, I wanted to go back to a point that Anastasia was making. I don't know. I almost felt like when you said, you taught Emeka 8 years ago, that was like so long ago, right? And I wonder if that's part of the issue is the printing press has been around for 600 years, and people are still coming up with new things to do with writing and printed material. So is part of it that we're so used to what's the newest, coolest thing, I can't use twine. Everybody's using twine now. Especially in academia, it's like, well, what's the newest thing to be using for your story or whatever. If how that kind of works into. You're saying, in the humanities, it would take a long time, but 8 years is nothing, right? And it goes back to the access too, that people, who were you teaching Emeka to then? Because you can barely find it out away from academia now, I think, right? The people that that are actually able to use it and stuff. I don't know, maybe speak to something about that.
Yeah, and I mean, I said that kind of in jest, because for one, that's about as long as I've been around digital humanities. Some of these tools have been part of that conversation for that length of time. But over in digital media, kind of as a discipline, one of the things we're constantly trying to explain to other disciplines is that we can't have a deck of slides that lasts more than like a year usually, because everything we use and everything we're expected to teach is constantly in a state of updating, right? If someone comes in and says that they learned HTML 5 years ago, then I will say, that's great, go relearn HTML, and then maybe you can teach one of our web classes. And it's not to say that the knowledge they had isn't going to be useful in learning what's current in HTML, but there is an expectation we are constantly updating our knowledge and ourselves and our tools that does drive how I think, at least I look at anything I encounter. There's that awareness of the pressure to evolve. And that, I say that a bit in jest, but part of it is the difficulty I think has come up a few times here of when you're working with something that's a tool that perhaps has a difficult interface or doesn't present in a way that's adapts to mobile, etc. You might be missing out on users. You might not be connecting to people. And one of the reasons why Twine as a throwback works so well for me and others is that in a way, it's like stripping out a lot of the things that we built up for a while and saying, this is something that will work on just about everything for a while. It's future-proof by being retro. But there are lots of other things we've built that's not true of, where you go back to like a DH archive project and realize that it was built in a fixed grid that it's hard to view on anything anymore, or where you go back and realize that as things fall out of date or are built with tools that aren't constantly thinking about the future of platforms, that their kind of longevity is challenged. And anecdotally, Aaron Reed just posted a morning of one of his projects that was only on the iPad for 2 years because he didn't update it again, and it was nearly impossible to update it to fit what iOS is right now, and so they removed it from the App Store. It's just gone. There's nothing you can really do with that. So when I look at kind of what people are using now, that's part of what I'm thinking about is, can people access it on the platforms, not just the ones they have in their pocket, but the ones that they're going to have in a few years? And who are we building for? The audience now, or someone we're imagining in the future? What does that mean for the tools we value and what we pick and how we think about what we're building?
This might be heresy, but I think we are focusing too much on the technology and not enough on the content. Technology is going to change, and it changes based on the market circumstances. You know, can I sell another version of the iPhone? Can I sell an updated iPad? But it's what's on it. It doesn't matter if it's, you know, an 8mm movie, if it's got power, if it says the right thing to the right people at the right time. So if we stop focusing so much on the tool and start focusing on what it builds, then I think we'd be a whole lot happier if we did all that.
Well, the frustrating thing is that our you know, when I came out of grad school, we were doing VHS. And VHS lasted for a while, a generation, it felt like almost. We grew up with VHS, and you know, then all of a sudden they had DVD, and then they had Blu-ray, and it moved quickly. And now these to be someone that does digital work really means that our lifespan of our stories that we create are starting to shrink, which means we have to embrace the latest technology, but the theory of the content is so important as well, that for me, we're always telling our stories in the latest thing, so it continues. So our stories continue because the technology really isn't lasting the lifespan that we want. So, you know, in 10 years, if we don't have stories in some type of VR environment, our children will probably not be learning Cherokee stories. So we'll have to make those stories. And it's frustrating for academia because obviously in academia, we move slower. We have slow hiring rates, we have slow process, we have to get the classes in. It takes a year and a half out to get those classes into the media, and then they were building those things a year and a half out as the technology changes within the semester. And now, you know, the iPhone comes out in 4K, so are we doing the traditional film stuff in 4K? Well, we got to get the equipment for it. So it's speeding up so quick that we're still having to address not only the content, but the rapid speed of which we have to change ourselves in an environment that can take a year and a half out to set up a course and get in the listing, which is difficult for someone that does technology work, which we don't know what the next iteration of storytelling is going to be in 3 years, because it could be almost all VR if the environment allows for it and the system's easy enough to adopt and we have people out there. But it might not be. It might still have some remnants of film and all of these other things, because the future is uncertain.
Stories that endure.
It is, but making sure that we have them updated through the process is the tricky part.
And also, I mean, I think that goes back to the question I was sort of posing to everybody, that, you know, what's the role of the digital there? And the way that you described it, it's sort of delivery system, tool versus content. And I wonder if that's sort of a myopic way to think about it a little bit. I mean, that wasn't as a critique, but sort of just, I wonder if that's sort of one of many ways to think about what the role of digital is in storytelling, right? So we can be thinking about digitality as a tool for delivery or exhibition or distribution or production even, right? Like 4K or certain resolution, or that camera versus this camera or something like that. But I wonder if there is a way to sort of unite, and if we should be thinking about ways to unite the digital, whatever that is, with the content, or use digitality as a way that isn't just about distribution platforms that are usually corporate, honestly, I mean, in the way that we've talked about them so far, and more about something that becomes a way to tell the story, something that becomes part of the design and development of our stories, part of the articulation. And I think that's one thing I like about Twine and the games that Anastasia was showing us, and some of the debate around those games, is that the affordances of digital platforms become so ingrained in the experience of that story that it's hard to separate the two. And I think that's actually, if done well, I guess, and even if done poorly, it becomes a different emotional experience. It becomes a different lasting sort of visceral thing that isn't so much about, am I looking at a screen to do this, but this is something that helps me experience the account that's being told to me in some way.
Well, the platform you choose, what is it, transmedia storytelling? The platform you choose changes the story, and it changes the experience for the teller and the receiver. But I think that we've lost the story part to the technology frequently. And so it isn't necessarily that I can tell a great story that's meaningful, that's transformative. It's like, oh, I can use this tool. Or I can use this, device.
Yeah, so let's get away from that.
Yeah.
So along the same lines, so the novelist I was talking about, Anastasia, publishes a novel every year, and there are similarities in union sets and slight partial union sets with what he's produced. So he produces a signature or a tempo that's recognizable, and readers sort of consumes and situates around that tempo. So this notion of story content, as opposed to platform, has that, and especially with disappearing platforms, is that notion of signature for individual creators of these platforms or team creators of these platforms still an important issue, or has that disappeared? Do creators of game platforms have signatures like a print artist?
Oh.
I mean,
The other disadvantage of old print formats like novels is that the author produces this monument, and then there's no place for the receiver to get in and modify that story and modify that self-centered signature. So I guess it's more of a comment, but do these new platforms still have that signature potential or not?
future?
I think that,
The material.
yeah, I think that we all have a certain version of how we see the world, and we bring that into every technology. And so, like for example, when you talk about these games, it's some of the same problems I have for video games. Is some of the people that are creating them are addressing them in a different thing. It seems to me, it's such a colonial philosophy of taking over, destroying, crushing things in a lot of video. But then when you have someone with a different mindset, you get a different creator. When they added more women video game designers, you had more women playing because it totally transformed the type of games that we're creating. And I think the more people from different cultures that come in and are able to actually interact, the very nature of the imprint of who that person is starts to come out, because the storytelling and the reason they're telling stories have changed. Like Never Alone is a beautiful little video game that you can play on your game, and it's really a beautiful game that tells these indigenous stories in the language even. But the reason they created it was very different than what Rockstar Games creates games. And because of that whole different philosophy, the very nature of that game is a very different experience. And I think that imprint always lasts in that. So the visual artist, the programmer that has a different philosophy, the reason you want to have a variety of programmers from different backgrounds is because you get that imprint. Even in the very code of which is written, comes from the person that's writing it, shows up. And I think that's inherently important to have a diverse work group on a project, so it actually hits a bigger, broader market that we don't always get in those shooter games.
I was thinking too about what Anastasia said about Flash, which I gather is now much harder to access, but it's like there's an imprint that seems like it's on the verge of disappearing unless something's not done to recuperate the images of the imprint.
Well, in the case of Flash, of course, it was a platform with particular affordances, particular things that you could do easily within it that became kind of the animation style of an era. Because of vector shapes and certain types of tweens were what it did well, people picking up used them, and then more and more clever people would make their own kind of approaches to making that interesting. And that is where you get kind of, I think, what you're thinking of in terms of a signature style. But to me, the more interesting thing about what happens in a lot of these online spaces is that they're really dedicated to the remix. And so fundamentally, like you talk about the novel as this kind of signature edifice, I think, well, yeah, but that's what the millions of fanfic distributed online now are for, is to say, we don't need that Harry Potter epilogue or, God forbid, Cursed Child. We can do better, and we have. And similarly, to go and say, well, if we just edit down all of the prequels to about 20 minutes, there might have been a movie there. We can put that on YouTube. And if you take any Twine story, you can go in, get into its source almost immediately, right? It's, to me, when we think about building in digital, building our stuff for remixing, acknowledging that the remix is one of the greatest values we get out of being in digital space is essential. So I mean, the choice of platform and the ideology of a platform is really about both the longevity, the access, and who controls the ultimate result. And then, of course, who can build upon it to make something new and perhaps better.
And I think we only have a minute left, right? So maybe,
Questions?
or something.
Talking about preserving things, I'm really intrigued by the game that disappeared and lasted for 24 hours. And could you just kind of talk about that in the context of what you were saying about preserving and why they didn't cost why?
So what Porpentine did is it essentially announced that she, as the creator, was not going to preserve that work, that she was going to destroy her own copies of it. And so she put it out into the web and invited people to kind of demonstrate they cared enough about the work to save it and then decide themselves what to do. So now there's copies of it throughout the world, and of course it's digital, so every copy is as good as the original. And people have been deciding what to do with that. You can go into its source code and remix it. I go into its source code and take it apart. And now it lives on through all these people who decide to care about it, which is really how digital preservation happens.
Thank you. Thank you for giving us your if I